taking the time to come giving your tech confession today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I basically, when I started IT, I mean, that was 25 years ago. Yeah, it really makes one feel old. I originally started in the whole Unix or Unix and mainframe world, and moved from there into more and more of the whole x86 world. And it's interesting to see how far we have come over all these years, moving from very physical large machines. I mean, it's still large machines, but the whole industry has evolved. But I think the interesting part in IT over the last few years is we still try to solve the same challenges in many companies. And people, I remember, I think a few months back when I looked back on what we did over the last 22 years in the company, I looked at it and saw 10, 15 years ago, we started to work intensively with VMware and started to talk about more and more about how you can actually work with software and actually move everything to software. And back then, everybody was scared about, or initially everybody said it's like, this is only good enough for testing. We can never actually use this in real life. And I was early on in saying, it's like, yeah, this is going to be real. And we can clearly run stuff in a physical, which is now in a physical world, in a virtual world. And over the years, we could see that all of that became more and more reality. People were moving more and more from the physical compute into the virtual world. What, however, we see on the other side is we have now all this wonderful technology there, but people and companies are by far not ready for it. I mean, and that was what I was just referring to in what I looked at over the last few months, is I reviewed old materials, old training materials. And basically, the interesting part is a lot of the message hasn't changed that much, because we moved from a point where we said it's like with virtualization you can provide compute resources within minutes. And look what we have nowadays, even Pat being on stage during keynotes and other things, we still talk about, hey, we can now provision workloads in minutes or seconds. So the overall message with software defined hasn't changed, and maybe some of it is also all around the point is that maybe we lost taking people to the next stage.
Right.
Many people still try to attach the old processes from 20, 25 years ago to new infrastructure. Companies and people haven't changed, and I think that is one of the challenges we see, why people are having such a hard time understanding that software-defined, being it for compute, network, or whatever software-defined next is coming, why that is such a hard point for them to actually get to that point, because it requires you to change your overall thinking. And I think when we look at it, we need to take a new approach. When we look at how students nowadays, from when they come from college or university, how they address programming and development, that's a completely different world. No one thinks about, oh, I need to buy a computer, I need to find a data center, I need to place it somewhere. They go into the cloud and order stuff and just use it. However, there is still a lot of legacy stuff out there, which sometimes I think people forget about, and maybe that's also the reason why we still have so many people who are still in the old hardware-defined world and still think, I need to keep it, that's the only way we can operate that. And nearly every time I have to talk to executives, it's very often, it's always the same story, is on an executive level, on the higher level in management, sometimes you hear companies really explaining, it's like, oh yeah, and we do this and that and that, and then you see down in the field, it's like, no, you are not. You might have the concept of it. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to convince more and more people that software-defined still is the future, and we need to move into these new technologies and how they make our life easier. And we also see out there that software-defined is not so much only compute, it's affecting us everywhere. I mean, I come from Germany, we have a huge car industry in Germany, yes. And when we look at it, the biggest mistake for Volkswagen over the last how many years the company existed is a software whether it's a bug or a predefined issue they created, but it's actually the company is depending so much on software, and that's where we can see that software is in so much more devices nowadays. Even if you look at, you buy a refrigerator or something, the first thing people actually, when they analyze errors or problems with it, is like, oh, let's connect a computer to it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a refrigerator.
With the TV
it should
inside.
Either a TV or anything. It's so many devices we have now, which in the end we see them as hardware devices, but they are operated by software. Everything is software nowadays. When you look at simple things like even watches, when you go throughout the conference, I mean, I'm old-fashioned there, but when you go through the conference, it's even software-defined watches. Everybody runs around with an Apple Watch or some other device. Even phones. I mean, you could complain nowadays about the phone quality. It's actually weird enough that, I mean, I had that just this morning. I called my wife and our little newborn, and it was actually a much better connection to call them over WhatsApp, which is more software defined, than calling them over the legacy phone line.
That's right.
And so it's weird, we can see it everywhere in our life, that software is actually not controlling it, but managing it. On the other hand, there's also tons of bad things which we can see if we look at, over the last few years, how software or social media influences elections and stuff like that, where we see bots actually controlling things. I think there is also going to be quite a few challenges ahead of us on how we are going to deal with this. Or simple things when you talk to, again, car industry, to engineers over there, about if an autonomous car is involved in a crash. Who's going to deal with that? It's no longer just an accident, because now all of a sudden a large corporation is responsible for it. And the problem there is also autonomous driving is again software defined. People tell you it's like, that would be possible today if we just remove the humans out of it. Maybe that's something we should also think about, is that software defined can also become scary at one point. And maybe that's also a reason why people get more and more confused, and sometimes people want to have the legacy hardware back because they get scared by it. Automation is scaring things. I remember, I think 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I was with a big cloud provider, and we had a strategy workshop, and all of a sudden in the strategy workshop, some of their people said, it's like, but if we are going to do this, what's going to be our job then? And I said, it's like, what do you normally tell your customers when you do the same to their people? It's like, you better find something new within the company which is helping you. And that was interesting, because it was the first time I also had within the IT industry explain to people, it's like, yeah, potentially IT is going to take your job away. And so it's no longer just because you are working in IT, you are safe from that, that you don't evolve anymore. We need to accept that the industry has changed. It becomes more and more software defined. The whole cloud wouldn't be possible without being software defined. So we need to think about it. On the other hand, we need to find ways to manage, control, and work with it, because just leaving the technology alone can also be potentially a difficult thing, as said, what we have seen over the last few years.
So you mentioned you're an instructor.
Yes.
I'm sure you have seen many little mini miracles, possibly your student software define aha moments of their own. Do you have any in particular that really stand out?
I mean, the first ones which were really impressive, I think, were in the early days, especially of VMware, when we first showed people this is vMotion. You can actually move a VM from one physical host to another physical host. And people were sitting there, it's like, this is not real, this doesn't make any sense. And that is, I think, one of the first moments where especially where I've seen students really get that, oh yeah, that really makes sense. And I think that helped a lot of people to get over it. And I think we see more and more demand for this, but I think also over the last few years, these big aha moments are gone. It's little tiny pieces here and there, not only in the VMware space, also in many other spaces. I mean, technologies like NSX are great, but they are not necessarily as visual. I'm moving from hardware to software, and all of a sudden I can move something from A to B. Stuff like NSX enables us to build a network which stretches from New York to London potentially, and we are still able to move a VM from London to New York, but you don't get that aha moment anymore from someone who says it's where you move it from London to New York, because people say it's like, yeah, it's taking a bit long, we should actually improve that. And it's like, yeah, it's quite a bit of a difference whether you have two computers sitting side by side and you move it from A to B, or you basically move it once completely over the Atlantic. But I think there is still, it's more little tiny pieces. And I think that's also why sometimes people, maybe with conferences and stuff like that, get a bit disappointed, because these big bang things are just not there anymore. I mean, even really consumer-focused companies like Apple have that problem. It's like, yeah, there is no new iPhone. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when we look at stuff like the iPhone, everybody has now either an iPhone or another smartphone. It hasn't really, the evolution on that space hasn't been big. It's still a touch screen, you still use your fingers to use it. Screens have changed, cameras have changed, but there is nothing. Maybe it needs someone to come up with something new, but...
Maybe it will be you.
Yeah, I'm not so much in that space. But again, all of these things can happen, but overall, I think the steps get smaller. I mean, the big steps in computing have been done. We still see the evolvement. Everything gets faster, it gets accessible, networks get more reliable. We can use all these scenarios everywhere, all the time. I mean, for me, I'm traveling a lot. I'm nearly every month or every second month on a long distance flight to somewhere around the globe. And actually, I like it that the airline I'm using still doesn't have Wi-Fi on these flights, because that's more or less, for me, the last place where I have 8, 10, 12 hours silence. No social media, no network, no nothing. And that's also nice. And I think that's sometimes something potentially people also need to go back and learn again. It's like, you can turn these devices off, and it's actually quite good to turn them off. Sometimes I have people ask me, it's like, why didn't you return my email or my call within half an hour? It's like, yeah, because I turned my phone off. And people look at you, why did you do that? It's like, yeah, because I wanted to get work done. And that's sometimes difficult if you get all these messages bubbling up. It's much harder to control yourself. Or I had it, I think, about a few months back. I was in an email conversation while I was at VMware headquarters in Palo Alto with someone, I think from VMware back in Germany, and then after I think 2 hours he wrote, it's like, he's going to bed now, he's not going to respond to my emails. And it was a bit of a harsh response, and I wrote back, it's like, you know that email is an asynchronous methodology. I never asked you to respond to my emails in the middle of the night. If you take your phone up and actually do that, it's your personal decision. Yeah. And I think maybe that's something everybody needs to learn that back, is to take personal decisions, to take your life back. Because if you don't do that, technology is going to rule it. And I also don't think that an approach like especially what we see in Europe, where companies now take the control about it and decide that you can't decide when you want to read your emails. They just decide from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. in the morning, you don't get any corporate emails anymore, and you can't even open your client anymore. I mean, you can take that as a decision as a company, but I think it's not helping people if you continuously take more and more out of their responsibility. And maybe it's something to explain also. It's like, you don't need to answer. If you don't have the time, you don't want to have it. We get great freedom with all of these technologies, but we also need to learn to work with them. If we make ourselves slaves of that smartphone or mobile phone, it's our own fault. These devices, you can turn them off, you can ignore all these messages, but I know it's sometimes hard. You get there and you get all these messages. And I mean, especially now being 10 hours behind Germany, when I open up the phone in the morning, it's over here. I have maybe a few hundred emails, and all kinds of other messages in there. And it's like, okay, I'm turning that away again because I don't want to actually have a miserable morning. But I think that's the point. I could immediately get up, or even in the evening here when I'm sitting in a bar or something, I'm not going to pick up my phone the whole time, because it's like there is some level of communication over social media, especially during conferences where you just connect with each other. Where are you? Should we meet up or something? But outside of that, I'm trying to be ignoring most of my customers or other things during that time, because I'm on a conference. I have an out-of-office mail saying I'm at a conference. My emails might be delayed. And I think those things should be acceptable.
And this is a great opportunity, of course, to network and meet other people that are passionate about VMware technologies.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so great. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit on the comfy couch with me. Thank you.
It was nice being here. Thank you.
When you are ready to make your tech confession, join us at techconfessionstheshow.com.